So I'd like to welcome our next speakers for today, which is Peter Lynch and Dr. Mats Nordahl. Peter Lynch is an architect and researcher at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. He headed the graduate architecture department at Cranbrook from 1996 to 2005 and has taught at Harvard, GSD, Columbia University, RISD, CCNY, Parsons, and Dalhousie University, Penn State, and KTH, where he was professor from 2015 to 2020. His current research project, Timescape Garden, is an urban biodiversity reserve in Norrköping, funded by Vinnova. An early version of the project was exhibited in the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale and published in Conceiving the Plan, Nuance and Intimacy in Civic Space, published by Skira 2021. Skira Editore will publish a monograph of Peter Lynch works in early 2025. And Mats. Dr. Mats Nordahl is a complex systems and data science researcher based at KTH. He is the founder of three startup companies working on applications of AI, in particular relating to the interpretation of sensor and visual data. He's also been involved in a range of interdisciplinary collaborations with artists and architects and designers, resulting in exhibited work and new developments in higher education. Peter and Mats have been collaborating on the Timescape Garden project since 2020. Please welcome them on stage.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you, Ingrid, for putting this whole incredible conference together. Mats and I will describe our work developing an AI-based tool for biodiversity monitoring. You can see what we'll do. I'll talk briefly about why we're working on biodiversity issues in a design context, what we're doing for Vinnova, and speculations on other applications of what we're working on. Okay, we all know that there is biodiversity collapse unfolding, but it's worthwhile to remember the scale and speed of the problem. And there's no question that there's a catastrophic decline in land mammal and insect species throughout the world, including here in Sweden, where studies show loss of moths and butterflies between 45 and 70%. Part of the cause is the loss of the most biodiverse biotope, which is in Sweden could be described as Hagmark landscape. It's the median landscape between agriculture and forest, a mix of grasslands and forest copses, with glades. If one wanted to reintroduce biodiversity, one could choose to try to reintroduce this type of landscape. Consequences include this most severe problem is fragmentation of landscape, not just disappearance of habitat. Fragmentation causes an inability for many different types of animals to connect from one patch to another, and basically extinction unfolds as a series of local extinctions. So it would be obvious to solve this problem by expanding the number of the area set aside as protected land, linking those areas together, but also improving the ecological quality of land that isn't explicitly protected for habitat. Here's our general study area, Norrköping and Bråviken Inlet. You can see here all of the protected areas in this study area, and of them the Natura 2000 areas there's grant funding available to study connectivity of these areas, because obviously the problem is it's an extremely scattered map of protected areas throughout Europe. How would they become functional? How would they become interconnected? Now in Sweden, there's no national authority that can oversee or even propose wildlife corridors at that national continental scale. Responsibility falls upon the counties, but they have no power. All they can do is advise the municipalities. And in a place like Norrköping, the likelihood that there would be large investment in protecting, setting aside land for biodiversity is highly unlikely. So one would have to turn to the next possibility, which is that unprotected land of different types, not specifically set aside as reserve, could be improved to function as habitat and perhaps function as a connected habitat. Now, here you can see in the map all of the green areas surrounding Norrköping, privately owned, also many municipally owned marginal green areas. And you could call them urban wastelands. The terminology is quite unsettled. But this includes places, buffer zones, semi-managed green areas owned by the municipality. This is what we're focusing on. And in a way, it's a very good application of the tool we're developing. Everyone would like to believe that a natural area left to itself would become a fecund, diverse ecosystem, what they call ruderal resilience. The idea that weeds and spontaneous growth would become a healthy, diverse system. Unfortunately, from our work, it seems that that is highly dubious. One needs to intervene, change the biotope, introduce new plants, change the substrate, and then periodically intervene with maintenance. The goal is to maintain as little as possible. So, there's another dimension, which is explicitly our realm as architects. It has to do with the aesthetic dimension. Why? Because if a place is not cared for, if it's not treasured, if it's not visited, it will not be maintained. It will not be upheld. So our focus is on this overlap between places that are attractive and used by visitors, human visitors, and fecund, diverse places. That's the kind of key. And we could say that this methodology we develop here, KTH, all architecture schools, intuitively driven design approach with aesthetic criteria, even that can benefit from an AI tools. One can imagine that a feedback loop within the design process. One still proceeds through intuition, but with knowledge of what actually the effects are of what one has done. So it would be important in a biodiversity preserve to know what are the animals there? What is their population? How is it changing? Where are they moving? That's the goal of the project. So, I'll see if I skip something. Okay, so from a research side, the problem is there's very limited knowledge about this. The actual presence of different species and the trends in terms of population. There's various initiatives strongly advanced now that seek to build a system of monitoring stations, continental scale, that would function like weather stations. The most well-known is the AMMOD project, a German project, trying to develop multimodal sensor stations and interconnectivity of databases between different entities, between nations. So the system, imagine the torrent of data from such a system. There's no way that one could manage near real-time data on biological monitoring without AI tools. It's too labor-intensive. And so the need for AI for the application we're working on is well acknowledged. So our project, Vinnova Research Project, I'll just go through quickly. Funding began in 2000. We actually began work out of interest. Funding began in 2001. Our work began in 2000. It's focused on this little red dot within the overall study area, Siltenberget. It's a small green area, municipally owned, surrounded by industry. The area is basically been semi-managed, more or less left to itself for decades. Once a year they mowed it. And what we did first was map the paths, both human and animal, projected new paths, located the trees, plantings, key areas, laid out new planting beds with the help of Peter Korn, a plant specialist and garden designer. We introduced 210 new plant species, mostly non-native species. And in another part, perhaps you can see the cursor, we introduced a forest glade. You can see we're, in a sense, reconstructing the Hagmark landscape here. That work was done by Linnea Rundgren, and we introduced over 40 fruit and seed-bearing species for improving habitat for all kinds of creatures. So the Skogsgläntan area, and it's now a very beautiful place. One can say that from data, we know that the number of people every day who's visited has increased more than 5 times. Perhaps this looks a little modest, but that's also the first phase, first year of planting. We introduce new paths, new benches, and the goal is to change perception. So we're introducing also a viewing pavilion. Within the pavilion, a special bench frames views in different directions, and we will be able to see whether people linger and whether they actually, let's say, take this offering of a vista. So the benefits in terms of biodiversity were immediate. 1 month after Peter Korn finished the planting, red-listed insect species returned. This was only seen 3 times before in Norrköping. A little terrifying that it is so direct, the cause and effect is so direct. So the project, AI dimension of the project requires data collection. Mats Nordahl's system, which he'll speak about, analyzes video data. So we've set up 3 different cameras. You can see the fields of view that are monitoring the site round the clock. Some of them been running for more than 2 years. We have over 40 terabytes of data. Now, obviously, no one will be able to watch 40 terabytes worth of data, 2 years of videos from 3 cameras. We need a system that can process that for us. Basically, we can think of it as a tool for what Lefebvre called rhythm analysis. So if this is one of the camera views, these are the Skogsgläntan camera, the overview camera, running 24/7 for 2 years. Here's 1 year cycle of images from that station point. The analysis involves transferring all movement within the field of view into vector lines. And Mats' system is so precise, you can see from here, that every possible movement that the camera, that resolution can detect, including even the trembling of the leaves in the trees, this is a zoomed in view, is registered. So the problem becomes, how do you sort that data also? We're calling it an AI-based system, a machine learning system, that can sort the vectors by apparent speed and direction. So from the overview camera, you can see all of the birds tracks that have crossed this within a small period. I don't know whether it's a week or 2 weeks. 2 weeks. So, and then sorted for movement of a certain speed. This is the human paths, people on the sidewalks, walking on the path, and the trembling of trees. So, Mats, you're going to take over now.
Right. You can keep that picture. I have my own. So, Let me add just a few words on the AI-based system for keeping track of the animals. So, tracking animals that pass by may seem like a rather simple task compared to what you have seen, for example, large language models achieve in the last few years. But if you think about it in another way, you realize that you realize that this may not be so easy. If we think about vision as a human sense, it has had 500 to 600 million years to develop from the first eye that's recorded in the fossil record 530 million years ago, and even higher cortical function is tens of millions of years old. Other human senses as well as hearing is hundreds of millions of years old. While language has a history that's perhaps 200,000 years, is somewhat unknown, but still. So we as humans have basically cognitive capabilities that are more or less unconscious but very powerful and occupy a lot of our brain. So it may not be as easy to solve these things as we think. Now there are various approaches in AI research to tracking objects. Many of those are more aimed at applications like self-driving cars, etc. And they typically work with video data that where you have somewhat larger objects in the image and more pixels to work with. There are algorithms that are considered state-of-the-art for detecting objects. They have names like YOLO or RCNN, etc. And tracking is mostly done by first identifying objects in each video frame and then having some form of algorithm that tries to connect them together. And that's perfectly adequate if you have images with enough resolution and can recognize the objects well enough. But in settings in the field, trying to detect small animals or very fast animals like birds passing by a camera, then this doesn't work so well. Then one has to pay more attention to the motion and less to the actual appearance. I'll show you a couple of raw videos in a second that illustrate this. So the research work that we are doing here at KTH is mostly aimed at those kinds of situations where you may have very small and fast objects like birds and insects, for example, or for that matter, drones far away, or objects that are camouflaged and hard to detect, which is very relevant to many animals in nature, or situations where simply the video quality is not good because either because you're trying to detect things in the dark. I mean, many animals are mostly active at night, or because of weather. And finally, a rather important point is that you want to create systems that really don't get into privacy issues related to surveillance. If you want to continuously monitor animal life, you will happen to monitor people that pass by as well. And then what can you do about that? You don't really want to store continuous surveillance video. You want systems that are do all the processing immediately at the camera so that no video is ever stored, only the information that a fox passed by, for example, or a human passed by, perhaps. But the aim we have is to avoid storing or transmitting any video information to as much as possible avoid getting into conflict with privacy issues, even if you would install this like in an urban park, for example. Right, so let me first show you a couple of illustrative raw videos to show you what we are dealing with. Right, so can you stop this? No? Right. Okay, so these are two pheasants that live on the hill at Siltenberget. As long as they were moving, you could probably see them, right? But now, if we stop this and you see a single frame, it's really, really difficult to detect the birds at all, showing that the eye is more sensitive once motion is involved. Here we have a fox at night, though it's still pretty bright because of the snow. It would be even worse if there wasn't any snow. Let's go on. The next is an owl. Here you see even more the difficulties of detecting objects at night and the poor resolution that you actually have to work with. And my final example has 3 hares in it. I think they're hares and not rabbits. Here you can see also the effects of human interventions, that the hares in winter search for food or find shelter, and the benches and tables are one of the places where the snow cover is not as thick, right? And they have easier time finding food. Right, and then one can do some categorization of the detected traces of animals. So I have a couple of examples of the hares that we saw in the last video, sorted according to the month. Oh, that didn't come out very well in the projection. But these are actually all traces of their movements, mostly at night during March of last year, and in April. And can we back to the March slide here? You can see, despite the poor resolution of this on the projector, that in March they actually spent a lot of time in the open areas where it was easier to find dry grass, etc., to eat, and that actually takes a long time for them to find. So you have all these little concentrations where they actually stay for a long time to eat. While there was less of that in April, because then it started they could find food elsewhere, etc., and then it became more an area that they passed through. And we can round off with just one more example of smaller animals, and this is actually related to the plants that were introduced. That these are tracks of very small birds, probably house sparrows, that in fact find food in one of the places where new plants were introduced. So I will let Peter round this off in 1 minute and say a little about future work.
Okay. As usual, we wanted to say too much. So actually, we only have time to take some questions.
Yeah. So if anyone has a question, I can pass the mic.
you were talking about the red-listed insect. Were you trying to get that insect back? Did you design for that? Is that the reason why you planted certain things that you did, or was that just a coincidence?
Well, we weren't aiming for that specific insect. What you're talking about is a good question. Are there indicator species that we were focusing on? We took a much more broad brush approach. As I mentioned, we planted 210 different species, mostly non-native. There's no database, an adequate database on how those non-native plants serve native insects. That's another aspect of the project. One of those cameras, we're going to use a higher resolution camera downward pointing so that we can trace the movement of insects and see which of the non-native species they're attracted to. So that's just one aspect of how we're developing it.
Any more questions?
Would you say that you would be for or against like a more large-scale monitoring of wildlife, like on a countrywide level or a global level, to fine adjust how many park benches we have to increase the biodiversity? Is that something that could be more in the future? Or
Are you asking because you're concerned about this?
not necessarily.
Well, I think that the scale of the task is so daunting that to imagine coverage even equal to a national weather station network would be an astonishing achievement. There's no way, unless there's processing greatly improved that can use surveillance data that's collected for other purposes, there's no way that there would be a system that's as extensive as you seem to ask about. But we're talking about the AMMOD project in Germany as the flagship project. They only have 6 stations so far. So we have a long way to go, and time is short to deal with this problem.
I'm a little bit curious about why did you decide to use non-native species? Because
Yes.
aren't you afraid that they become
Invasive.
invasive? Or
Okay, I have to tell you something. This is always the first question. And we have so little time, but I can tell you very quickly that the expertise we're relying on, Peter Korn's work, which you can find very easily on the internet, he's a strong advocate of introducing non-native species because he's pointed out that there is no such thing as a native climate anymore. The climate that the Sweden's wildflowers are accustomed to, the Hagmark landscape, for example, doesn't exist in urban environments, which are too dry, they're too hot. And so if there's no native landscape, then reintroducing native species would be a problem. So he's spent his career, decades, going through Europe, finding landscapes that are equivalent in climate to what our landscape has become. And the argument about invasive species and the problem of them getting out of control, this is certainly a problem for water plants. But if you look at the list of all the invasive species that are basically warning lists, and almost all are water-based, water-borne plants. So the question is, isn't this a risk worth taking? The other argument against non-native species that I mentioned was that will they feed the native insects? And that's a problem of knowledge that we can help answer.
Yeah, no. So thank you very much, Peter and Mats. It's been really wonderful learning from your research, and I'm so happy to see direct application of AI for good, for getting more diversity in the environment. It's amazing.